I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully
execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
Chief Justice John Roberts.
These are the rules by which we govern ourselves. You know, like if you're going to play any game, you've got to know what the rules are. And governing, of course, is not a game. It's more important. But it's the same principle. You have to know what the rules are. And governments in world history have so often abused the power they had. And people have suffered because of it. And the framers decided they were going to lay down some rules to try to keep that from happening. That's what the Constitution is.
The Constitution resides here at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., but the debate over its meaning has continued since its ratification on September 17, 1787.
And I think what the framers were most interested in is the structure of the whole thing. The decision to take the powers of the government and divide them up into three separate branches and to try to make sure that each branch stayed within its own sphere. The structure, saying this is the presidency, this is the president's power, this is the legislature, this is what they can do, here's the judiciary. And that's really where the main protection of our liberty resides. That is their way of preventing the government from becoming too powerful. And I think that's the part that is, at least for me anyway, very interesting.
Article 1 of the Constitution created the Congress, which today includes 435 members of the House elected every 2 years, and 100 senators elected every 6 years. The job of Congress, debating the issues and making the laws, as both bodies did during the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. Congressman John Lewis and Senator George Allen.
Because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we don't have to risk our lives anymore. We don't have to pass a so-called literacy test. On one occasion, a man in Alabama was asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. On another occasion, a man was asked to count the number of jelly beans in a jar. On one occasion, there was a man in Tuskegee, Alabama, who had a PhD degree, and he was told that he could not read or write well enough. He failed the so-called literacy test. The Voting Rights Act was good in 1965. It's still good today.
The enactment of the Voting Rights Act was absolutely necessary 41 years ago and was initially passed during a very tumultuous time in our country's history. In fact, the Voting Rights Act should have been passed many years before then. But history has proven that the law was just and appropriate to provide equal opportunities and protections to persons with a desire to express themselves at the ballot box.
It's in Article 1 that the House has the power to impeach, and the Senate the power to try those impeachments, with the Chief Justice of the United States presiding. Those constitutional authorities were on display in 1999 during the impeachment trial of President Bill Clinton.
At this time, I will administer the oath to all senators in the chamber in conformance with Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution and the Senate impeachment rules. Will all senators now stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of William Jefferson Clinton, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help you God?
Article 2 of the Constitution created the American presidency. Elected every 4 years, the President signs bills into law, and with the advice and consent of the Senate, makes treaties, appoints a cabinet, judges to the federal judiciary, and justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. While the President is Commander-in-Chief, it's Congress who has the power to declare war. However, it has not used this power since World War II. President Franklin D. Roosevelt urging Congress to declare war.
I have the distinguished honor of presenting the President of the United States.
Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The American system is one of checks and balances, which inherently leads to tensions between the branches. An example? President Bush and Senator Russell Feingold. The issue? Constitutional authority to authorize a domestic terrorism surveillance program.
So to prevent another attack, based on authority given to me by the Constitution and by statute, I have authorized a terrorist surveillance program to aggressively pursue the international communications of suspected al-Qaeda operatives and affiliates to and from America. Previous presidents have used the same constitutional authority I have, and federal courts have approved the use of that authority. Appropriate members of Congress have been kept informed.
All of us in this body took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and bear true allegiance to the same. Fulfilling that oath requires us to speak clearly and forcefully when the President violates the law. This resolution allows us to send a clear message that the President's conduct was wrong, and we must do that. The President's actions demand a formal judgment from Congress. At moments in our history like this, we are reminded why the founders balanced the powers of the different branches of government so carefully in the Constitution.
Article 3 of the Constitution created the U.S. Supreme Court, nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate. Supreme Court justices serve a life term. When there's a question about constitutional law, the Supreme Court has the final say.
If you tour around Washington, D.C., you know, when they moved the government here, the first thing they did was set up the White House for the President, next the Capitol for the legislative branch. People forgot about the Supreme Court. We didn't get our own building until 1935, and I think that was a good indication of how significant people regarded the judiciary. Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers said it's the weakest branch, and certainly for the early part of its history it lived up to that. Then John Marshall came along, and John Marshall established the court as the interpreter of the Constitution. In his famous decision he wrote of Marbury versus Madison, he basically said, look, we're a court, we have to decide cases. If in deciding a case we have to determine what the Constitution means, well, that's our job under the Constitution. He regarded the Constitution as law. That's one way that our Constitution is different from a lot of others. In many countries that have constitutions, they're really just political documents. And if you have a dispute under the Constitution, it's going to be resolved however disputes are going to be resolved. Maybe in an election if you're lucky, maybe by force of arms if you're not, maybe by the mob. However political disputes are resolved, that's how they would resolve constitutional questions. John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison said this is different. The Constitution is a political document. It sets up the political structures, but it's also a law. And if it's a law, we have the courts to tell what it means, and that's binding on the other branches. And that important insight into how the Constitution works has been, I think, the secret to its success, because you do have a final interpretation of its meaning that is binding on the political branches by a branch that's separate from the political branches.
Over these 200 years, the Constitution has been tested. It's shaped landmark events in our country and served to decide the path of our nation. The resignation of President Richard Nixon.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule.
Here, inside these walls of the Supreme Court, the Constitution continues to be tested. Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus the Board of Education, Roe versus Wade, all decisions based on the Constitution and its amendments. And in the 2000 presidential election, we saw the Constitution tested again in Bush versus Gore.
Mr. Olson, do I understand that your argument on the equal protection branch would render academic what was your main argument that's troublesome, that is, that we must say the Florida Supreme Court was so misguided in its application of its own law that we reject that and we, the Supreme Court of the United States, decide what the Florida law is?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question, and whether that would render academic the challenge. There is a clear constitutional violation in our opinion with respect to Article 2, because virtually every aspect of Florida's election code has been changed.
Now the U.S. Supreme Court has spoken. Let there be no doubt. While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession. I also accept my responsibility, which I will discharge unconditionally, to honor the new president-elect and do everything possible to help him bring Americans together in fulfillment of the great vision that our Declaration of Independence defines and that our Constitution affirms and defends.
200 years ago, in the election of 1800, America faced another close presidential election. A tie in the Electoral College put the outcome into the hands of Congress. After 6 days of voting and 36 ballots, the House of Representatives elected Thomas Jefferson, the third President of the United States. That election brought the first transfer of power from one party to another in our new democracy.
James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, wanted to ensure the rights of citizens were protected. This led to a series of amendments. The first 10 are the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment gives rights to freedom of speech, religion, the press, assembly, and petition. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. The Fourth, right against unreasonable search and seizures. And the 10th gives power to the states.
I don't think I have any particular amendment that sort of is more favorite than any other. I mean, obviously, we get a lot of interesting issues under the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, and the reason we get a lot of interesting issues under those, they're the ones that tend to be written for the ages, as it were, in broader terms, because I think the framers really recognized and hoped they were forming a charter to govern for the centuries. And so they were using phrases like reasonable search and seizure and phrases like that that they realized would have to be given meaning by their successors.
From the preamble to the Bill of Rights and the amendments that followed, the U.S. Constitution is the guiding framework to govern our nation. Political leaders may change every time citizens vote, but the words of the Constitution remain.
You know, when they start, we look at a lot of problems today and we think, well, this is hopeless. How are you going to solve this? That was kind of what they started with. I mean, you had small states that thought they were going to be left out. You had big states that weren't willing to give up any power. People had very different views on a lot of things. And yet they were able, by sitting down in this room and kind of thrashing it out, closing it off, no press in the room while they tried to work this out, to come up with you know, a great compromise that allowed the small states, the big states, the merchant states, the agricultural states, everybody to kind of come together. With, of course, one exception. They never worked out what to do about slavery and just kind of shuttled that aside and decided we're not going to talk about that. And that taint in the Constitution, you know, took a civil war to remove. But with that exception, I think they did a remarkable job of bringing all these diverse interests together and agreeing on a way of going forward that I'd have to say even the most optimistic of them really probably didn't envision what the United States would become.
We must always remember that our Constitution is to be celebrated not for being old, but for being young. Young with the same energy, spirit, and promise that filled each eventful day in Philadelphia State House. We will be guided tonight by their acts, and we will be guided forever by their words.
You know, when the framers finished crafting our Constitution in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin stood in Independence Hall and he reflected on the carving of the sun. It was on the back of a chair he saw. The sun was low on the horizon. So he said this, he said, "I've often wondered whether that sun was rising or setting. Today," Franklin said, "I have the happiness to know it's a rising sun." Today, because each succeeding generation of Americans has kept the fire of freedom burning brightly, lighting those frontiers of possibility, we all still bask in the glow and the warmth of Mr. Franklin's rising sun.
The American Constitution, over 200 years old, 4,543 words, 27 amendments. Revolutionary in 1787. One nation with liberty and justice for all. C-SPAN, where the Constitution comes to life every day. Created by cable. Offered as a public